You
All
got
right,
this.
hello everyone. I've got another video for you, and this time I've got Tim from Secret Fire Books with me. Hopefully you go over and check out his channel. He's got a great channel. We've interacted before. I've been on the Elusive Exclusive Book Society, which was a lot of fun. And we were chatting a little bit. I've been going through this whole list of books that they're called the masterpieces of science fiction that Easton Press put together. And Tim had some interest in reading Dragonflight, and we chatted about it. And so he's joining me for this one as we discuss Dragonflight. Looks like we got the same copy there too.
Yep.
So just a little background. This there was a couple of the novellas in this one that was published originally in analog science fiction. And Anne McCaffrey won, I think, the first female Nebula Award and the Hugo Award for novellas. So that was kind of cool. Didn't
Yeah, it's
realize that at the
awesome.
time. And then I think John W. Campbell just encouraged her to kind of finish out the story and they published it into a novel. So you learn a lot of stuff as you go through all these books.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So I guess we'll start with just kind of like what was your quick kind of overall impression of this one?
So I knew going into this that this was sort of a science fantasy. Um, I was not prepared for some of the crazy, like out there science fiction elements that we'd get in this. But for the most part, I enjoyed it. Towards the end, it gets a little. I'm sure we'll talk about it. It gets a little bit, wibbly wobbly, timey wimey kind of stuff. But for the most part, it was a very solid narrative. It is a dense book. It's less than 300 pages, but there's a lot in this one novel, and yeah, it was quite a trip.
Yeah, I always, I saw these books around when I was a kid, and I always just thought it was like YA fantasy kind
Mm.
of. And as I started reading it, and then lately people have said, this is more science fiction in a way, even though it kind of reads like fantasy. But
Mhm.
I was thinking to myself, if like younger adults or even ki people in their teens were reading this, like good on them. If they could comprehend all this stuff and follow everything, then they're on the track to be a good reader.
I know it's some big ideas going on.
Yeah. Yeah, and I was kind of the same. I was really impressed in the beginning of it. Some of the predictability maybe and wonkiness at the end maybe brought it down a little bit, but I'm really glad this is like one of those seminal works of science
Mhm.
fantasy or whatever you want to call it, and I'm glad I finally got around to reading this one.
Mm. And it's ridiculous because it's a huge series.
Oh
I
yeah.
forget how many. It's like 20 something books in the series.
Yeah.
Half they're not halfway through, but quite a way through. Anne McCaffrey passed away, and her son took over for the series. And so yeah, I think he's still writing the books. I think there's one that comes out next year or something like that.
Yeah.
It's it's crazy. But I thought it was gonna be like I don't know. I thought it was going to be this huge, like interconnected, long running. But this one book was very self contained. Like I said, it's very dense, but it's got like a solid beginning, middle, and end. And I was not prepared for just how trying to think of the right word, just how I don't know, just how solid of a book it was because it's obviously, like you said, an early bit of science fantasy, and it was back in the day where science fiction and fantasy were kind of blurring the lines
Hmm.
and like publishing houses didn't know how to treat fantasy. They were like, is it an offshoot of science fiction? Is it for kids? Is it for young adults? What are we doing here? And yeah, I feel like she blended a lot of those elements really well. um I don't know if you knew this. I was the fifth book of Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archive came out sometime last week or the week before, something like that. And I watched an interview that Barnes and Noble did with him, and he was saying how much of an inspiration Anne McCaffrey was on his work. And so I was like, well, that's going to be interesting to read Dragonflight. And I was kind of amazed just how much of his work. I don't know if you've read any Brandon Sanderson, but
Yeah.
it,
None of his major ones. I read a couple
Okay.
of his smaller novels. I forget the
Gotcha.
Elantra or something, maybe.
Elantris, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of his stuff, but I love his original Mistborn trilogy. And reading Dragonflight, there is a lot of Dragonflight in Mistborn, especially the first book. So I can definitely see like maybe not the specific science fiction elements, but the tone of the story, kind of the world building, how the supernatural powers work and stuff. I can definitely see where that came from. So it was really interesting, kind of seeing the source from all that.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure this was her first novel. So, I mean,
Yeah.
if you start out of the gate with this thing, then in 1968, this is impressive.
Oh yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, and talking about the sequels and prequels and everything, I'm sure there's this kind of data dump prologue in a way. And after reading that, knowing how many books, I'm sure she's written whole books about just some of these, paragraphs or sentences she's throwing out in that prologue. And the
Mhm.
prologue had me hooked. We talked about it a little bit before, and I think you're going to kind of go over and give us a little taste of what the setup of the prologue is on this one.
Yeah, you want me to go do that right now?
Sure, if you want.
Yeah. So the basically the setup for this entire series is a two-page prologue at the beginning before chapter one. And essentially we are so far in the future that mankind has left Earth. They've colonized other planets and they've gone to this star system called the Ruckbat star system. And one of the planets orbiting Ruckbat is this planet called Pern. And so humanity makes these they settle these colonies on Pern, and only afterward do they realize that there is this sister planet that's called the Red Star. Called that because it just appears as this big red dot in the sky. And it has this strangely erratic orbit. And whenever it passes close to Pern, the atmosphere, something in the atmosphere causes these acidic fungi like spores to drift off of the red star. They rain down on Pern, and whatever organic matter they touch just gets devoured by these things, and they call them the threads. These like fungal spores called the threads. And when I found out what they do to combat these things, I was like, okay, now I'm hooked on this because you'd think, okay, they're in the distant future. What do they come up with some kind of like super weapon to destroy these things? Do they, do something to like change the trajectory of this planet's orbit? No, they make biologically engineered fire-breathing dragons to blow these things out of the sky as they're raining down on Pern. And so it essentially says that they start this culture that's centered around dragons and the Dragonriders. And at this point in the story, we have gotten to the point where it's been so long since the Red Star crossed orbits with Pern, and it's been so long since anyone has seen any of the threads that how do they put it? Once relieved of imminent danger, Pern settled into a more comfortable way of life. The descendants of heroes fell into disfavor as the legends fell into disrepute. So yeah, they are now totally ignorant to what has come before.
Yeah, it was almost like they would come around every 200 years or something, but because of some
Mm.
of the other planets, every once in a while, this erratic other red star planet would just get kind of taken out of its normal orbit. So it was like something like 400 years.
Yeah,
And now people are like, that was a myth. That never happened. And yeah, it's a really good
it's weird.
setup.
It's got to the point where they have like this. It's just a straight up like feudal medieval society essentially, where they've regressed so far, and yeah, they totally forget that they needed these dragons, and they've become resentful of them.
Yeah, and these dragons were kind of bred up from some sort of native animal on
Mm.
the planet. So it is, I mean, from the prologue, I was like, okay, now I see how this is could be like full on science fiction. The way she set it up like that, I mean, everything could be completely plausible there. But as you read, once you get into the story, it definitely reads like a fantasy, but you're always reminded that this is like a science fiction story, really, in a lot of regards.
Oh yeah, it's. I mean, they go in depth with uh, how the dragons are bred, how they're raised, how humans have this specifically the dragon. they call them the dragon men, these humans that have these telepathic links with the dragons, how they interact with them and how society has changed based on catering to these dragon people and their beasts that they ride around blasting fungal spores out of the sky.
Yeah, and they like these dragon people could focus on training their dragons and keeping their numbers up, and all these other holds or kind of little civilized groups would basically pay them tithing. They would give them food and give them all the stuff so that they could focus on this kind of defense. And when we start actually in the novel, since it had been so long, there's a lot of pushback from a lot of these groups and these holds saying, why are we giving them all of our food? Like there's none of these threads coming anymore. This is just
Mm-hmm.
myth. And I guess we're getting into the book a little bit here. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I will say that when it starts up, it's very much like an epic fantasy where they're throwing out like the proper nouns and the names of different areas, and they don't like really take time to explain things. I think Anne McCaffrey was just she's betting that she would do a good enough job where um, the reader just kind of grasps onto things as they go, and within like what the first two chapters, they introduce the dragon men and how they treat their dragons, and they're eventually they find this one feudal lord, Fax, I think that was his name, and
hmm
he like the other lords is starting to disregard the dragons and their authority, and he has gone so far as to take over all these other holds by force, and now he kind of like owns a big swath of the northern continent or whatever, and yeah, they're just throwing out all these like facts and proper nouns, and you kind of feel like you've just been dropped into the middle of this narrative, but you do gradually catch on, and I think she did a really good job of making it feel like a lived-in world, so that she didn't have to like info dump or anything. The only real info dump is that introduction.
Yeah, totally. And it's like real subtle. The In the beginning, there's this guy Fax, and you don't know if he's good or bad at first. But just some of the interactions with him and some of the other characters and this like nuance she puts on it, you start to realize he's kind of, he's the villain in this one.
Yeah.
But it's never just like told to you. There's no big exposition data dump given to you. You just, like you said, you're kind of thrown into it. It's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess once you get into the story, the main character, her name's Lessa, I guess you would
Mm-hmm.
pronounce it. And another thing, maybe why this is kind of considered YA is this is a very hero-driven story. It's probably not too much of a spoiler, but there's not that many bad things that happen to the characters you start to like. I
Yeah.
haven't read a ton of fantasy, but when I get into some of these situations, I start going back to like the Songs of Fire and Ice, and I'm like, oh no, what's gonna happen here?
Someone's getting stabbed.
Yeah, there's going to be a whole chapter how we're going to like recover from this scene, but
Right.
it's definitely more of like a hero fantasy, and
Yeah.
so she's kind of like this chosen one you learn pretty early on, and
Mm-hmm.
her family was kind of in they had one of these holds before that guy Fax came in and killed basically all of her family, and she had to kind of hide out and use some of her telepathy powers to make people think she wasn't who she was in a way. So she's been like biding her time, trying to overthrow this guy Fax in every way she can. And one of these dragon riders, this main guy, they go on this kind of they're seeking a female to kind of bond with a queen dragon when one presents itself, I guess. And so they've sent everybody out. They're looking for one of these females that could possibly lead one of their queen dragons. And she kind of gets Fax and the main dragon rider into this conflict, which works out in her favor. And then that kind of sets up the whole story for her and her hero's journey and her relationship with this queen dragon. And I don't know if you want to expand on that, but that's kind of the basic setup of this one.
Yeah, it's it starts off as kind of being a revenge story because, like you said, she's kind of trying to manipulate the people in this hold to, help her overthrow Fax, who's taken over her family's hold. And then gradually that kind of just can't get gets hand waved away because at the same time that she is being essentially chosen to be the partner for this yet unborn queen dragon, Fax's one of his wives gives birth to an heir essentially, and so because he owns everything, the the people there just kind of accept this newborn infant as their new lord, and Falar, who is the leader of the Dragon Men, or at least the leader of this one wing. They call them the wing, like the separate squadrons of dragons. So the wing that finds Lessa at her hold, their leader Falar essentially invites her to be a candidate for this new queen dragon, and essentially says, there's nothing for you here anymore. They're all gonna treat this new baby like he's the lord of your family's old hold. So you might as well serve the greater good and join the Dragonriders. And so yeah, it ends up becoming this kind of coming of age story.
Yeah.
But the weird thing was though, and this is again where I started to see like parallels. That whole thing is very much how Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson starts.
Hmm.
You have a female protagonist who has been living this persecuted, oppressed life, and then a hero comes in, shows her these powers that she was starting to develop. She used them to overthrow the people that were in charge of her. Then he's like, "Hey, you can join this greater good. Come join my team." And that's basically where the similarities end. But for the first like 100 pages or so, I was like, "Okay, this plot's just going to be." Mistborn just stole the first act of this plot, but eventually it does be it goes off in a very different direction, and I was kind of surprised where the story went because at that point, I guess I would say that Lessa and Falar, the wing leader, are they kind of share double duty as the main characters. I would say
Hmm.
because you get a lot from his perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, and these dragons, this is told pretty early on too. They have this ability where they can kind of move throughout space almost instantaneously. And
Mm.
so they make a bond. Each dragon is kind of bonded with a rider, and they have this kind of telepathic ability amongst themselves. And if they can imagine a location, then they can just transport there almost like instantaneously. And
Mm-hmm.
that's definitely into the plot, plays into the plot. And then there is also guess you kind of have to mention it. I don't think we don't have to go into detail, but there's a time travel element to this story too. And well, I'm not sure I was a complete fan of it. It almost became superhero type, kind of like they could almost do anything, but there was limitations to it, and they had to kind of work around some issues with it. But it definitely became another big part of the novel as you got into it.
Here's the one thing that bothered me about that though is we've said that in order to they call it going in between. In order to essentially warp from one place to another, the dragon and the rider have to both envision where they want to be, and that's how they teleport to where they want to be. But the going in between time, so time traveling in their case, works a similar way, but you have to picture the destination you want at a particular time. You have to remember a particular time when you've been there, and then that's how you travel back in time. And I kind of thought, wouldn't that mean that that's how going in between works all the time? Because technically, if you remember an area you've been before, aren't you always picturing how it was in the past? So wouldn't you always be
Hmm.
blinking in and out of the past?
Yeah. Yeah, maybe it took some sort of extra mental effort or something to also cross the time barrier or something, but
Maybe because like when we introduced the concept of going in between fairly early in the book, I was like, okay, that's really cool. These not only are they fire breathing dragons, they're fire breathing dragons with like the warp drive from
yeah.
from Star Trek, essentially. But yeah, then they introduced going in between time, and I was like, okay, this makes it a little more I don't know, like you said, it's kind of like some Avengers Endgame,
Yeah.
wibbly wobbly time travel kind of stuff. And I don't know. I'm not a huge fan of time travel stories. So anytime you interject time travel into something, I'm like, okay, where is this going? But
Yeah, for sure.
yeah.
Yeah, it can be done really well. I've found some really good short stories recently that handled time travel in just a unique way. But with this one, when it came to, she described everything in the prologue to where I felt like this was a science fiction, but between the telepathy not really being described, the transportation between areas, and then the time jumps, and it never really being explained, that's where I felt like it was getting more into the fantasy. Not that it's a bad thing or anything like that,
Mhm.
but it definitely was never explained how this worked. It was just saying, here it is.
Yeah.
But like the dragons, you'd think that was a fantasy element, but she explained these were, a creature that was bred up, and this is science fiction here, but
Mhm.
you know. So yeah, probably don't, I don't know. Probably don't want to talk too much more about the plot unless you have any other um just thinking about that. Move into like what you didn't like about it overall, maybe, or what you really liked.
Well, I mean, aside from the time travel aspects being a little wonky, but I can forgive that because I think in the end it worked itself out to a pretty I don't know I won't say much, but yeah, it works itself out by the end. Um, Aside from that, we touched on it a little bit how our one main character Alessa is a little nothing bad really ever happens to her, and if it does, it gets set straight pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. I wasn't the biggest fan of her as a character just because she gets introduced to this whole dragon culture. Before that she was essentially a serf living underneath this guy Fax and being a slave essentially. And she gets invited by Falar to join this dragon society and learn how to be a dragon rider. And she immediately connects with the queen dragon. Um, but I felt like every time she screwed up and every time she like went against orders and did something wrong, it always ended up working in her favor eventually. And I was like, it's a little too convenient. Like how many times did we get a scene where Lar grabs her, shakes her by the shoulders, and says, "What is wrong with you?" And then it immediately cuts to, "Oh wait, this actually ended up working out in her favor."
Yeah, he almost has to apologize every single time, like,
He does.
oh, did it again.
Yeah, he had it has to constant. One of the most constant things that happens in this story is Falar kind of like rolling his eyes and be like, oh, "Okay, you did good, kid. Hit the showers."
Yeah. The shaking is funny too. He had to kind of knock some sense, or he thought he was knocking some sense into her a few times.
Yeah, it's not a huge spoiler, but by the end of this, by the end of the book, where she's like, "Don't tell Fax, he'll shake me," or "Don't tell Falar, he'll shake me again." I
Yeah.
was like, "Okay, that's funny."
Yeah. Yeah, I think like I mean it was really well written. It was paced really well. I Some parts were predictable, but as soon as I thought I kind of, and I don't like go into books trying to figure them out, but some of them were very predictable. But then she did a couple twists and it maybe didn't happen exactly like you thought. So I was always invested in reading it and never like didn't want to pick this book up and read it. I really
Yeah.
enjoyed the process of reading it overall. And the way she handled the blend of science fiction and fantasy, I think was done great. And then, I think the things that we almost didn't like about it is maybe why this would be a great young adult book. And
Mhm.
props to anybody who picks this up as a teenager or whatever. This is great. There's not a ton of sex in this thing. You're not going to be crying because your hero dies.
Yeah.
Um, and I think part of it is kind of a challenging read, but yeah, I mean, I can see why it's so popular. I can see why you see these books everywhere,
Mhm.
and yeah, it was definitely a good one.
I do you have any of the other ones? Because I have the original trilogy, I guess you call it. Because I know
Yeah,
the second book, Dragon Quest, is okay. Yeah, I have the exact ones. Yeah, so Dragon Quest, I know, is a direct sequel,
yeah,
and then the White Dragon, which apparently there was like a reading order that Anne McCaffrey set for her books, and she says you shouldn't read White Dragon after you read Dragon Quest. But everywhere I see these books, they always have the first three books published as like a trilogy. So
Yeah.
I don't know, you know.
Yeah, I think from what I could tell, you could read them just like these three, but most people say, yeah, there's another trilogy that kind of goes in between,
Mm.
and maybe it gives you more context or something. But I don't know. Are you gonna read any more of these?
I'm definitely going to finish the first trilogy. You
Yeah.
know, like it's one of those things where it's like we said, it's like a 20 something book long series. I'm sure I'll never get around to all of them, but I'm definitely going to try to finish the first trilogy because there's enough of those, like we said, those cool science fiction elements that blend with the fantasy world building. And Anne McCaffrey does a good enough job of making the world feel lived in and feel like it's a real, you know, a logically probable place, even though she doesn't describe everything in detail.
Yeah.
I could see myself getting sucked into the elements of this.
Oh, totally. Yeah, I was kind of in the beginning, I was thinking, man, I definitely want to read the whole thing. Um, you do get a pretty good resolution to the story.
Mm-hmm.
There's, this, you can imagine these dragons breathing fire to take out these threads is basically what they've been bred to. And you get some of that in this book, but I think there's a lot more she could do with this whole world we're in, and
Oh yeah,
if it stopped at where this one ends, there's a lot more that kind of is got me intrigued. So I think I'm going to, um, you know, I'm still kind of on the fence. I might grab one of the books pretty soon and jump into another one, or I might kind of hold off for a while. I'm still not decided.
that's fair. Like yeah, I can't. I don't know. It could be end up being like one of my favorite series. I have no idea. Uh, but yeah, I'll just have to see it with the rest of the trilogy, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, I could almost see myself like I've only done it so far with one series, well, maybe two series where just like I had a book in the middle that I knew caught me, and then I went back to the beginning and read them more in like internal chronological order, not really in publication order. And you read all the way through like it was the foundation, the Asimov's Greater Future History. I forget how many books.
Mhm.
There's probably like 13 books or something. But it can be a really rewarding experience. And recently I read one of the Vorkosian Saga books by
Mhm.
Lewis McMaster Bugel. I was really impressed with that one. So I was thinking I might go back at some point and try to like read through that whole series. But yeah, I could see the appeal of this one too. So it sounds like we basically had kind of the same overall impression, huh?
Pretty much. Like I said, it's I think today it could be considered like an above average novel, but for what was it, 1968, right?
Oh
That
yeah,
it's like super ahead of its time. So I mean,
totally.
like
Yeah.
it got the jump on a lot of things.
Yeah, for it to hold up and for a couple grown men reading this, which, you
Yeah.
might, like I talked about my impression of who would read this. It's like,
Hmm.
it's way better than I thought. So,
Oh yeah.
yeah. Well, cool, Tim. Thanks a lot for joining me on this one.
Absolutely. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, you might have to get me to read something that takes me out of my comfort zone a little bit sometime. And
Oh my gosh. Well, speaking of long running series, you should check out the Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. It's urban fantasy noir essentially.
I read the first one.
Oh, okay, sweet.
I didn't like it because of
Oh,
some of
dang it.
the stuff he did. Everyone said he kind of mellows out on the way Dresden treats women.
Yes, he does. Well, the funny thing is, he does a little bit, but he also just adds more female characters over the course of the series, and he writes characters really well, so they're all awesome. So
Yeah.
at one point, Harry Dresden is kind of like outnumbered by the awesome female characters in that series. So yeah, he can't be sexist at that point.
Well, yeah, cool.
Right.
And Go on.
I'm sure I'll find something else for you to read because, oh my gosh, there's so many. I have so many ridiculous long running series like fantasy and science fiction that I have not got into yet, and I need an excuse to like start
Yeah,
reading them.
yeah, for sure. And then you want to talk about any videos you did recently or anything like that? Um,
Well, recently I did a Solomon Kane review. Solomon Kane by Robert E. Howard, some old swashbuckling pulp stories. A little bit ago, I uploaded a video where it was just it was me looking through some old young adult novels from my collection. That one was fun. And then depending on when this goes up, but in any case, uh, be doing a live stream with Pulp Mortem and Book Graveyard for our last live stream for the Elusive Exclusive Book Society, where we'll just be hanging out and opening books that we sent each other and just talking about our year.
yeah, and
But
I'll edit in the thumbnail. It's an epic thumbnail for that one.
yes, please do. Jake from Pulp Mortem is so proud of his thumbnail skills.
Yeah. Well, cool, man. Thanks for joining me. It was a blast.
Absolutely, anytime.
All right. Talk to you later.
All right, catch you later.